There's a moment that changes some people forever. It doesn't arrive with a tragedy. There's no dramatic goodbye, no betrayal big enough to become a story. It begins with something almost invisible. One evening, your phone lights up. A message from someone you used to enjoy talking to. You read it. You stare at the screen. Your thumb hovers over the keyboard. And for the first time, you don't know what to say. Not because you're angry. Not because you're busy. Because replying suddenly feels like stepping back into a conversation you've already outgrown. That feeling is difficult to explain. Most people assume you've become distant. Some think you're depressed. Others quietly decide you've become arrogant. Very few ever ask a different question. What if nothing is wrong with you? What if your mind has simply stopped settling for what once felt normal? That question has echoed through the lives of countless people. Not just high achievers. Not just deep thinkers. But people who, over time, began paying closer attention to themselves, to others, and to the invisible patterns hidden inside everyday life. At first, nothing seems different. You still show up. You still smile. You still laugh at the right moments. But something inside you has started listening more carefully than before. You notice the friend who only calls when life falls apart. The coworker who celebrates your mistakes more enthusiastically than your successes. The conversation that lasts an hour, yet leaves you feeling completely unseen. You can't explain why. You only know that what once felt comforting now feels strangely hollow. It's a quiet realization. But quiet realizations often change lives more than loud ones ever do. Imagine walking into a house you've lived in for years. Every photograph is still hanging on the wall. Every chair is exactly where you left it. Nothing has changed. Until someone opens the curtains. The room isn't different. The light is. And suddenly you notice the dust floating through the air. The cracks in the paint. The corners you've somehow never really looked at before. Human relationships can change in much the same way. People don't always become different overnight. Sometimes, your ability to notice them does. Psychologists have found that as self-awareness grows, people often become more intentional about where they invest their attention and emotional energy. Not because they care less, because they begin to understand that attention is not an unlimited resource. Every unnecessary argument costs something. Every performative friendship asks for a piece of you. Every relationship built on pretending quietly teaches you to disappear from yourself. Most people never notice that last part. They spend years protecting relationships, while slowly abandoning the person living inside them. And perhaps that's the greatest irony. You can be surrounded by people, and still feel like no one has met the real you. Maybe you've experienced that. Laughing at dinner, only to sit alone in your parked car afterward, wondering why pretending to be understood feels more exhausting than being alone. If you have, you're far from the only one. Many people reach a point where they stop asking, "How do I make more people like me?" and begin asking something much harder. Where do I no longer have to perform? That single question changes everything. Because from that moment on, life stops becoming a search for approval. It becomes a search for authenticity. And authenticity has a surprising cost. It asks you to disappoint people who only love the version of you that never said no. It asks you to leave conversations that no longer nourish you. It asks you to become comfortable with being misunderstood. From the outside, it can look like you've disappeared. Inside, something entirely different is happening. You're finally becoming visible to yourself. And strangely enough, that's where the real journey begins. Because the first change isn't learning how to walk away from people. It's learning how to recognize the difference between being included and being genuinely connected. And once your mind sees that difference, it rarely forgets it. There's a particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. You can rest for 8 hours, wake up with a clear mind, and still feel it by 10 a.m. Sitting in a meeting, standing in a kitchen at a party, scrolling through a group chat that used to feel like home. It isn't your body asking for rest. It's something else, something quieter, something almost impossible to explain to someone who has never felt it. Because on paper, nothing is wrong. The room is full of familiar faces. The conversation is friendly. Someone just told a joke, and you laughed at the right moment. And yet, underneath all of it, a small, persistent thought keeps surfacing. I can't wait to leave. Not because you dislike these people, because some part of you is working overtime, and no one else in the room can see it. Here's what almost nobody tells you about becoming more self-aware. It doesn't just change what you notice. It changes how much effort noticing takes. Most people can sit through a conversation and simply enjoy it. The words land, the moment passes, and that's the end of it. But once your mind starts paying closer attention to people, something shifts. You stop just hearing the sentence. You start hearing the sentence underneath the sentence. Someone says, "I'm so happy for you." And instead of simply accepting it, some part of you is already checking. Does their face agree with their voice? Someone says, "We should hang out more." And you find yourself quietly calculating how many times they've said that and how many times it actually happened. You didn't ask your mind to do this. It just started doing it on its own. And that's the part that's exhausting. Because while everyone else is enjoying a simple dinner, you're running a second conversation in the background, reading tone, tracking inconsistencies, sensing the tiny gap between what someone means and what they say. It's like being the only person in the room who can hear a second radio station playing underneath the music. Everyone else is dancing. You're the only one who notices it's slightly out of tune. Think about the last time you drove home from somewhere crowded, a family dinner, a birthday party, a work event, and turned the radio off the second you got in the car. Not because you wanted silence, because your mind had been working so hard to process everyone else's words, faces, and undertones that it simply had nothing left to give to anything more. That's not antisocial behavior. That's a nervous system asking for a break. Psychologists who study attention have long noted something important. Focus is not unlimited. Every conversation, every social interaction, draws from the same limited pool of mental energy. And the more closely someone reads people, the faster that pool runs dry. This is why, over time, many people quietly begin making a trade they never consciously decided to make. They stop asking, "How many people can I keep up with?" and start asking, "How few people can I be fully honest with?" It sounds like a small shift. It isn't. Because somewhere along the way, a birthday party with 50 guests started to feel lonelier than a quiet dinner with one person who actually listens. A group chat with 40 unread messages started to feel less meaningful than a single phone call that lasted 20 minutes and said something real. This is the part people misunderstand the most. They assume a smaller circle means something was lost. Fewer friends, fewer invitations, fewer people checking in. But nobody talks about what's gained in that trade. The energy that used to go toward managing 40 surface-level relationships suddenly has somewhere else to go, into the 2 or 3 that were always worth the wait, into the version of yourself that doesn't have to perform anymore, into evenings spent actually resting, instead of recovering from being seen. There's a strange kind of grief in this stage, though, one nobody prepares you for. Because even as you understand exactly why you're pulling back, you still miss the version of yourself that didn't have to. The version who could sit in any room, with anyone, and simply enjoy the noise without hearing what was underneath it. That person is gone now. And most days, that feels like a fair trade. Some days, it doesn't feel fair at all. It just feels lonely. There's a specific kind of argument that stays with you longer than it should. Not because of what was said, because of how confused you felt afterward, driving home, replaying the conversation, trying to figure out at what exact point it went wrong. You remember staying calm. You remember choosing your words carefully. And yet somehow, the other person reacted as if you'd attacked them. For years, you might have walked away from moments like that thinking the same thing. I must have said it wrong. I must have come across harsher than I meant to. You'd rehearse it in your head, softening your sentences, searching for the version of the conversation where they wouldn't have reacted that way. Then, at some point, a different thought quietly interrupts that habit. What if this was never about me at all? Carl Jung once suggested something worth sitting with. That until people become aware of what's happening inside their own minds, they'll keep calling it fate or blaming someone else for it. In plainer terms, not every reaction is really about you. Sometimes it's about something the other person is still carrying. Think about the person who tenses up the moment you mention an achievement, a promotion, a trip, a small win you were excited to share. You didn't say anything unkind. You didn't brag. You simply told them something good. And still, their face changed. Their voice sharpened. The conversation moved somewhere colder. For a long time, you might have taken that personally, wondered what you did, apologized for being happy out loud. But watch that pattern enough times, in enough rooms, with enough different people, and a different possibility starts to form. Maybe it was never really about the achievement. Maybe, sometimes, it quietly touched something they were already struggling with. The same might be true for the friend who constantly interrupts, who can't seem to let a sentence finish without inserting their own. It isn't always confidence. For some people, it can be closer to the opposite, an old, quiet fear of being forgotten mid-conversation, of not maturing enough to finish the thought. And the person who calls 5 times in one evening, who reads a delayed reply as rejection, they aren't necessarily clingy because they don't respect your time. In some cases, what they're carrying has very little to do with you at all, and a lot to do with something that started long before you ever met them. Once you start considering this, really considering it, something in you softens. Not because the behavior stops hurting, but because you stop assuming you're always the reason for it. There's a strange kind of relief in that, and a strange kind of grief, too. Because for years, maybe without realizing it, you'd been carrying other people's weather like it was your own. Someone walks into the room cold, and you spend the whole evening wondering what you did. Someone goes quiet, and you rearrange your entire mood trying to fix it. You mistake their storm for something you caused, something only you can calm. And the more you understand that reactions often say more about the person having them than the person receiving them, the less often you reach for an apology that was never yours to give. This isn't the same as stopping caring. It's closer to the opposite. Because caring without understanding is exhausting. It asks you to absorb everything, fix everything, carry everyone. Caring with understanding is different. It lets you stay warm without staying responsible for a weather system you didn't create. Some call this emotional intelligence, understanding what's happening inside yourself and inside others, without letting either one hijack your decisions. It sounds simple when it's written down like that. It rarely feels simple when you're living it. Because understanding someone's pain doesn't mean you owe them access to your peace. You can recognize where someone's reaction might be coming from, and still choose not to answer every call. You can feel compassion for someone's struggle, and still stop sharing your good news with them. You can even understand exactly why someone hurt you, and still walk out of the room. This is where the real shift happens. Not in becoming colder, in becoming clearer. You start reserving your energy, not for the loudest reaction in the room, but for the ones that actually reflect something true about you. And slowly, without planning it, you stop replaying old arguments on the drive home. Because you finally understand something that took years to learn. Some people were never really arguing with you. Sometimes, they were arguing with something inside themselves, and you just happened to be standing close enough to hear it. And once you stop carrying emotions that were never yours, something unexpected happens. Silence no longer feels empty. It begins to feel like home. That's a strange sentence to sit with, because for most of your life, silence probably meant something was missing. A phone that wasn't ringing. A weekend with no plans. A room with no one in it. You were taught, in 1,000 small ways, that silence was a problem to solve. So you filled it. With plans you didn't really want to make. With conversations you didn't really want to have. With a phone screen that lit up your face at 11 p.m., long after your body had asked to sleep. Not because any of it made you happy, but because the alternative, an evening with nothing and no one, felt like something to be avoided. Maybe you remember a specific night like that. Sitting at home, nowhere to be, no one to talk to, and a heaviness settling in that felt a lot like loneliness. So you reached for your phone, scrolled through people's highlight reels, texted someone just to have something to do. Anything to avoid sitting there with just your own thoughts for company. For some people, that pattern lasts for years without ever being questioned. But sometimes, something shifts. Picture a different kind of evening. You make a cup of tea and don't check your phone while the water boils. The house is quiet. Rain taps lightly against the window. You sit down, and for the first time in longer than you can remember, you don't reach for the remote. You just let the room be quiet. At first, it feels uncomfortable, almost too quiet. Your mind, so used to noise, starts looking for something to fill the space. But if you stay in that discomfort a little longer than usual, something interesting happens. The silence stops feeling like absence. It starts feeling like room to breathe. Some psychologists suggest that healthy solitude gives the mind something modern life rarely does: enough quiet to finally hear itself. It isn't about avoiding people. It's about no longer needing constant company to feel okay. There's a difference between those two things that's easy to miss from the outside, and even harder to explain to people who haven't experienced it themselves. Someone might ask, "Are you okay? You've been staying in a lot lately." And the honest answer isn't sad at all. "I think I finally like being here with myself." That sentence would have sounded strange to you once. Maybe it still sounds a little strange now. But for some people, this stage marks a real turning point. The moment they stop treating their own company as a last resort and start treating it as something worth having. Loneliness asks, "Who is coming?" Solitude asks, "Who have you become?" Only one of those questions you can actually answer alone. In that space, without anyone else's voice to respond to, other things start to get louder. Your own opinions, for once, instead of the ones you'd absorbed just to keep the peace. Questions you'd been avoiding, because there was always somewhere else to be, someone else to attend to. A version of yourself that had been waiting, patiently, for the noise to finally stop. This doesn't mean the people in your life stop mattering. It doesn't mean every night alone is peaceful, or that solitude magically fixes what's difficult. Some nights, it's still just quiet, and quiet is still sometimes hard. But increasingly, on the nights that matter, something different happens. You stop reaching for your phone to escape the moment. You start reaching for a book, a thought, a question you've been meaning to sit with. You stop needing someone else to tell you the day meant something. You start being able to tell yourself. Somewhere in that quiet, without any announcement, a version of you that had been waiting a long time finally got the chance to speak. And once you begin hearing your own voice again, you also start noticing something you weren't expecting. The calendar that once stayed full begins to look different. The invitations you never used to question start feeling optional. The life that once impressed everyone else begins to feel strangely unfamiliar to you. Few people wake up one morning and decide to become a different person. That's not usually how it happens. If you asked most people to point to the exact day their life changed, the day they stopped chasing every invitation, stopped answering every message right away, stopped explaining themselves to people who'd already made up their minds, most couldn't do it. Not because it didn't happen, because it happened too quietly to notice at the time. It started with one dinner you almost didn't go to. You stood in front of your closet for 10 minutes, holding the invitation on your phone, half-dressed, asking yourself a question you'd never quite let yourself ask before. Do I actually want to go? Or do I just not want to explain why I'm not going? You went anyway. But something about that question stayed with you. A few weeks later, it came back. A different event, the same tired feeling before you'd even picked out what to wear. You still went. But you left early this time. No dramatic exit. You just said you were tired, and for once, that was the whole explanation. No performance. No apology dressed up as a reason. Almost no one noticed. That's the strange part. The moment that would later look, in hindsight, like the beginning of everything, passed almost completely unremarked. No one there had any idea they were watching the first quiet decision in a long chain of them. Then came the group chat. You used to answer within minutes. Somewhere along the way, Minutes became hours. Hours became the next day. Eventually, you stopped feeling guilty about it. Then came the friend you used to check in on every week, out of habit more than desire. One week you didn't. Nothing happened. The sky didn't fall. And some quiet part of you noted that. None of these moments, on their own, meant anything. A late reply is just a late reply. One skipped dinner is just one dinner. But string enough of them together, spread out over months, sometimes years, and you get something that can look, from the outside, like a sudden disappearance. They've changed. They used to be so much more social. I don't know what happened to them. What actually happened rarely fits into a sentence people can say at a dinner party. Because the truth is usually slower and less dramatic than anyone watching from the outside could guess. There wasn't one conversation that changed everything. There were dozens of small ones, most of them with yourself, in front of a closet, in a quiet kitchen, on a walk home. Each one asking the same question in a slightly different way. Does this still feel true to who I am? Some days, the answer was yes. You kept the friendship, the plan, the tradition. Other days, the answer was quietly no. And you let that thing go, usually without telling anyone why, sometimes without fully understanding it yourself. Add up enough of those small, private answers, and eventually a life takes shape. One that can look quite different from the version you were building on autopilot. People rarely disappear all at once. For many, it happens the way a coastline changes, not in a single storm, but in thousands of small waves, each one taking away something so small it goes unnoticed, until one day someone who hasn't visited in years comes back and says, "Wait, this isn't how I remember it." You didn't announce a single one of those changes. You just stopped attending the version of your life that never asked what you actually wanted. And here is something that doesn't get said enough about this stage. It isn't always peaceful. Some of those choices come with real grief. A friendship that quietly ends isn't nothing, even when it's the right ending. A family gathering you skip still leaves a small ache, even when skipping it was honest. Growth doesn't erase the cost. It just means you decided the cost was worth paying. One evening, you look around your home. Nothing in the room has changed. Yet somehow, you realize the person living in it has. By the time anyone else notices, you've become different, quieter, harder to pin down, less available than you used to be. The truth is, that person has often already existed for a while. They just finally stopped hiding. Nobody vanishes overnight. They just stopped showing up for a life that was never fully theirs. One quiet decision, one ordinary evening, at a time. And sometimes, what looks like disappearing from the outside is simply someone, for the first time in years, choosing themselves. Tomorrow morning, your phone will ring. Someone will ask if you're free this weekend. Maybe you'll say yes. Maybe you'll say no. Neither answer will matter nearly as much as the reason behind it. Because there will be a moment, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe not for a while, when your old life quietly asks for you back. An old group chat, an old friend, an old version of yourself that knew how to show up for everyone except the person living inside. And in that moment, one quiet question will decide more than you'd expect. Not, am I becoming distant? But, am I finally becoming honest? Because running away can look a lot like walking towards something. From the outside, the two are almost impossible to tell apart. The same canceled plans, the same unread messages, the same smaller circle. But on the inside, they never feel the same. One comes from fear. The other comes from clarity. You'll know which one you're living, not by thinking about it too hard, but by how quiet it feels when you finally choose it. I'm curious, was there a moment when you realized you could no longer keep living the way everyone expected you to? Tell me about it below. I read every one. One day, someone might say to you, "You disappeared." Smile when they do, because you'll know something they don't. You never disappeared. You simply stopped disappearing from yourself. Maybe that's the truth this whole story was circling from the very beginning. The one hiding underneath the question we started with. People assumed self-aware people withdraw because they stop caring about everyone else. Maybe that was never quite right. Maybe the people who seem to disappear are simply the ones who finally stopped abandoning themselves. Until next time, keep noticing, keep questioning, and keep coming home to yourself.